November. Those of you who follow the story of Scotland's struggle for independence very closely will probably know that there was a big event, I think you could call it, last week, involving the two parties who were linked together in Scotland's attempt at the UN to begin its own process, an application that Scotland wanted to make to have the country reclassified as a non-self-governing territory, which would change the legal status of Scotland as a nation from being part of the UK as a voluntary union, which we know is a fallacy, to being a non-self-governing territory of the UK, which would make us effectively a colony. A non-self-governing territory is the diplomatic term used in the UN for a colony, basically a country which is being invaded, taken over by another, and has been absorbed into that other larger nation. So that was why SALVO-Liberation Scotland and Justice for All International, as their legal representation, went to both the UN HQ in New York and in Geneva. Now, essentially what happened at this event was that Justice for All International, which is an international legal firm who specialise in huge class actions like this, where countries, entire populations are represented at the UN by this very senior legal figure who knows international law. His job, or the representative of Mr. What's his name? Sheriff Azizov, I think, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, represented Scotland's interests. But having said that, the extent of his involvement was to bring along representatives from SALVO-Liberation Scotland to observe how two other small colonies achieved the same goal. And those were, if I remember the names correctly, one of them was New Caledonia, and the other was French Polynesia. Both of these small island nations were invaded separately by France and the United Kingdom, and have remained parts of their, I suppose, their empires, if you like, ever since. And these remnants still remain. And the islanders were requesting that their classification be changed to non-self-governing territories, as well as a step towards finally gaining their independence. So that was all well and good. So the Scottish delegation observed this happening, and Mr. I remember his name, Mr. Azizov, was representing these two other nations and presented the case for them to become non-self-governing territories. And SALVO-Liberation Scotland were there to observe the process, see how it worked, and finally for SALVO-Liberation Scotland, on behalf of the nation, with Mr. Azizov acting as their legal representation, to formally intimate that they intended to make the same request, to ask for a change of status from being part of a union to being a non-self-governing territory. Now that was all done, everything was done. And so technically at the end of this process, Mr. Azizov and SALVO-Liberation had kind of come to the end of that phase. Mr. Azizov's help, if you like, his professional services at that moment were really just tailing off, and the contract was about to end at the end of this month, beginning of December. What happened last week was an unexpected change. SALVO-Liberation Scotland had decided to terminate the contract with JPTI earlier than planned, a month earlier in fact, using a clause in the Memorandum of Understanding which both these parties signed prior to the engagement of Mr. Azizov as a representative. And so SALVO-Liberation Scotland announced that they planned to end the contract early. That would have been fine, but there was, and I'm not really allowed to talk about the details of what was said here because this is now subject of a legal case between the two parties, so I can't talk about details, but there was an exchange of messages between the two parties where accusations were made by one side against another, and in the fog of all of this, the actual point at which this event was instigated seemed to have got lost in all of this clutter. Nobody really knew what happened. I know certain information about how this transpired, what the timeline was, and where the rupture began, and who it was who said or did something which initiated the rupture. However, it's been represented by many independent supporters as a problem within SALVO-Liberation. Now, to be fair, that is not a conclusion that you can draw at the moment based on the information available, simply because this clutter, this confusion of who said what to whom, who initiated this argument, and why the contract terminated early, are all kind of lost in the noise of people accusing one another of things. But what it has done, and I think is obvious to all of us, is that it has undermined the case for Scottish independence at the United Nations in a way which none of the parties from our side, so Liberation Scotland and Salvo, would ever have voluntarily done themselves. And that is my opinion, it's not a fact, but I cannot see why SALVO-Liberation Scotland, or sorry, SALVO-Liberation would have initiated a rupture like this, undermining their own case. It doesn't make any sense. So to me, this was a huge anomalous and glaring inconsistency in what should have been happening. Mr. Azov's contract should have run out at the end of this month. They should have parted with a handshake. Thank you very much for your services. And remember, he was paid to do the work that he has done. There have been allegations about this too, I believe. Anyway, amid the fog of people arguing about this, we must remember to focus on one thing. Who benefited from this rupture? It wasn't Salvo and Liberation Scotland. It wasn't Scotland itself which benefited from this rupture. This disagreement, however it was caused and whatever precipitated it, was not to the benefit of Scotland. So whose benefit was it to? Now you could speculate, and this would be speculation, that the real beneficiary in all of this would of course be the United Kingdom's interests, because they would have been watching this and thinking, oh my God, the Scots have finally got representation at the UN, they've got a senior legal figure representing them, they're making a request to have their legal status changed from being a part of the UK to being a colony, effectively, non-self-governing territory, which would enable them, as us, as we're talking about ourselves here, to actually disentangle ourselves from the UK perfectly legally and legitimately. Now the UK would have been pretty scared by this, they would have been shocked by this development, and to my mind at least, this might have led to them trying to interfere in this process somehow. On the plus side though, no matter how this happened and whether the United Kingdom was involved in this or not, the plain fact of the matter is that it actually hasn't done any damage to the cause legally, because the foundations have been laid at the UN and that remains unchanged. The attempts to discredit SALVO-Liberation Scotland have largely just been, I think Craig Murray described this as a storm in a teacup, and I think that was the idea. The idea was to create confusion and to sow enough doubt amongst ourselves about Salvo, about Liberation Scotland's role in this, and about JPTI, for basically the whole thing to start unraveling and for people to start turning on one another and to start blaming each other for how this thing came about. Unfortunately, the sadness in this is that if this were a British attempt to destabilise this entire effort, then it's had some effect. It has damaged people's trust in one another. You'll know that my catchphrase at the end of this show is always the same. Keep the faith. Trust the people on your side. Who are the people on your side who you think would have been got at and nobbled this? Because I can't think of anyone that I personally know in any of the organisations that I've mentioned who would ever deliberately derail this process in such a way. It makes no sense. And even if as some have suggested, and I had even thought, in fact spoke out loud, that this might be the case, that there had been some incompetence or some mistakes made by our side. I don't think there were now. I think it's created doubt even in my mind a few days ago about who caused this and how it happened and what was the actual cause at the root of it. And I had thought, sometimes when you look at an incongruous event like this, something very, very massively unlikely to ever happen, there are two options. You know, it's either been caused by something we don't know about, or it's been a mistake or a blunder by our own side. And the natural sort of thing that most people would assume is it's some kind of mistake on our side, because it's easier to explain it that way than to not know what the real cause was. We're always frightened of the unknown. So my own take on this is that SALVO-Liberation Scotland, the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, in fact the SNP, Believe in Scotland, and all of the other groups and organisations which are supporting independence have not changed and didn't play any role in how this came about. I don't believe that any of our own actors were responsible for this, because it wouldn't make any sense. The amount of bribery necessary to get some patriot to completely turncoat and nobble something like this would be enormous, and it would become obvious very quickly. I don't believe it's happened. I think there's enough doubt, and the toxin of doubt has spread far enough into the movement to have us all wondering, and that was the whole idea behind it, I believe. However, because this is now a legal matter, nobody's really allowed to know what actually happened, because a court will now have to decide which of the two sides was telling the truth. So a judge, I presume, or a panel of judges will have to look at the evidence, both from our side, from Liberation Scotland and Salvo, and the Justice for All International side, and to decide which of these two organisations or individuals within them actually initiated this disagreement, because it is a disagreement. So I think we can all calm down. I've had quite a long time to think this over and chew it over, and it's very easy to have a knee-jerk reaction to something like this, because it's outrageous that anyone on our side would ever do this, and the anger that that would actually induce in most of us is sometimes enough to get us doubting our own friends. And that is something I won't do, because I don't believe that anybody on the pro-independence side would ever do something like this. It would not benefit the cause, it would destroy their reputations personally, and probably they would end up being outcasts. Nobody would ever think of doing that. So that's where I want to leave it. I want to leave it hanging. I want to let you make your own judgments on this. There is some evidence out there on the internet. I've been lucky to see some of the more private email correspondences and Twitter tweets and X posts and things like that between the parties concerned, and I can see how it was developing, but it still remains unclear who actually caused it. And I think because of that, that's the glaring anomaly in this. It should have been obvious who caused it, but it isn't. And that really gets my spider senses tingling, that there's something very far wrong with this situation. And because it was so unlikely, especially after what had been achieved at the UN recently, for it to happen right now, couldn't be a coincidence. Something happened, somebody initiated this, and I just cannot believe for a moment that anybody from our side would do it. So that is my position. I'm keeping the faith, because otherwise our movement will fracture. If we don't trust one another, we have nothing. If we don't keep our unity, we have no case whatsoever. If we keep squabbling with one another over who did what, we are going to stay disunited and unable to actually fight a sensible campaign. And that, I believe, is the whole idea behind this rupture. Whoever initiated it and however it was done, it's had a very minor effect. It's caused enough rancor within the ranks for it to end the JPTI contract early, which incidentally, as far as I know, was done under the terms of a former Memorandum of Understanding, which was an initial legal instrument used to forge the foundations of what the later agreement became. So as far as I'm aware, what has happened has not been illegal, and the contract has been ended legitimately, but why is going to be the subject of a legal battle. So I guess we wait to see what the truth is, but maybe some people who've reacted angrily to this and started casting blame around, particularly in the direction of our side, may end up looking a little silly later on if they discover that it wasn't in fact what they thought. The British state is incredibly good at this kind of subterfuge and this kind of divide and rule methodology. It is essentially the typical British playbook when dealing with colonials, is to divide them, get them fighting amongst themselves and looking elsewhere for blame, when in actual fact the real culprit is right in front of us. Anyway, I'm going to end this program here. It's a very complicated topic. I can't go into details because of the legal constraints around this issue now. I can only tell you a little bit about what I know, that there has been a disagreement, contracts ended early, and there is an acrimonious dispute going on. Other than that, there are no hard facts available in the public domain that we're allowed to know, simply because it's now subject to legal restrictions. So I'm not going to talk about it any further, but I just would urge you to just think who would profit from it. And once you start thinking that way, you'll begin to realize yourself exactly what was at the root of it. So keep the faith, and I'll see you next time on Inde-Car. Bye for now.